Hi Booktube, Aaron here, hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of May. May has been a pretty good reading month, and I think since the last reading update that I did, the last wrap up that I did at the beginning of last month, I think I've read about 10 books. Many of them are poetry. Only one of them is a novel. That's something that's sort of been characteristic of my reading this month, is a bit of a shying away from fiction. But yeah, there's a fair bit of poetry, and we've got some non-fiction and one novel. I'm going to breeze through a few things first. I'm going to quickly show you a couple of books that are ongoing, and then I'll just sort of show you some books that I've already talked about. I made a random reading update for 3 books sort of partway through the month, and there are 2 books that were for an event that have got their own video as well. So we'll get to them in a bit. But first, we've got 2 books that I'm in the middle of that I've been dipping in and out of. The first is this. This is Bell's English Poetry, and this is volume 1, early ballads, and they are just these early traditional ballads that have been sort of passed down from generation to generation and were eventually written down. And yeah, they're often dealing with well, quite a few of them are about outlaws and things like that, and some of the more entertaining ones I read this month were to do with Robin Hood, and it's always interesting to see how Robin Hood is he's not quite the character you expect him to be when he shows up in these early ballads. Certainly the idea of stealing from the rich to give to the poor hasn't quite made it, hasn't quite developed by the time that these ballads were written, but it's still a lot of fun. Next up, I've got King Arthur's Tale, King Arthur's Death, which will be fun. I haven't really read anything particularly Arthurian for some time, so that's one I've been dipping in and out of. And then one of my sort of projects for the year is making my way through all of Michele de Montaigne's essays, and I've been really enjoying them. And I've also been, the other part of the project is to read The Anatomy of Melancholy, which I think by now I've decided just to put to one side for the time being, at least until I've finished reading Montaigne. I find Montaigne just much more personable and entertaining on the page, and also he just deals with so many subject matters. I'm currently in the middle of a very long chapter called An Apology for Raymond Sebald. And Raymond Sebald had written this religious tract in this sort of pidgin Latin. It was like a mix, I think, of Spanish, Italian and Latin, and Montaigne's father had asked him to translate it into French for him so he could read it a little easier. And then Montaigne published his translation, and then this is then included in his essays, is this 200-page apology for this theologian. I think a lot of people at the time felt that he was maybe a little lightweight, I suppose, and so he's initially talking about why he finds him worthwhile, but Montaigne being Montaigne, he just sort of flits from subject matter to subject matter. So at the moment he's been sort of talking about how initially I think how animals are kind of different to humans, or actually no, initially he's talking about how we don't necessarily need language to communicate, which gets him onto the subject of humans and animals, which then morphs into this exploration of how animals can learn and have characteristics that are sort of similar to humans, and it just kind of goes out of nowhere, and that really wasn't the first long digression in there, and that's part of the fun of Montaigne. You're looking through the subject matter, or trying to get an idea of the subject matter just by the names of the essays in there, on constancy on drunkenness or whatever. But you never know what anecdotes or what quotations or just what perambulations he's going to pull out of the hat. And so he keeps you on your toes, and he never feels too intellectual. It always seems very down to earth and just really conversational. So I've been really enjoying Montaigne. So we're approaching the halfway point. As I said, this apology that I'm in the middle of at the moment is a good 200 pages long. So by the time I finish that, I will be more than half the way through Montaigne's complete essays. On to books that I've already talked about. There are two books that I recently made a video for Maybe Midrash, which is an event where we read books about religion. It was an idea of Jason from All Blues Chapter and Verse, and you typically read one work of fiction, one work of non-fiction. For the kind of fiction side of things, I went with Paradise Lost, and my sort of short opinion is that I loved Paradise Lost and could see where all these conversations about Paradise Lost that I'd heard about were coming from, and yet there's just so much more to it than I was expecting to find, and so I'm enjoying. I'm looking forward to enjoying it more and living with it a bit more. So yeah, very much enjoyed Paradise Lost. And then the non-fiction, I decided to go with Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, which is a kind of book of psychotheology, using a particular part of the book of Job for him to express this idea of God and how it's a sort of symbol for human nature. And I'll be honest, I didn't really understand it and couldn't quite see where he was coming from. But I also sort of, from reading the introduction and stuff, get the idea that it'd probably make more sense if you were just reading the collected works of Jung all the way through, because you probably already have an inkling of some of his other opinions and the sort of framework for his thinking. And then there are three books that I mentioned in a reading update earlier in May, and they were Natasha's Dance, a cultural history of Russia by Orlando Figes, which is really, really good. I essentially came away from this book with the general impression that the history of Russia is this long series of sort of reinventions, sort of cultural revolutions, but through it all there's a kind of chauvinism, I suppose, this sense of superiority, and at times that's very religious, at other times maybe it's more political, but it sort of stays there all the way through and is kind of still there. So really, really fascinating. So I'd recommend this if you're interested in the subject. I also read How They Broke Britain by James O'Brien, a book about politics in the UK in the last decade or so, and particularly the sort of ecosystem that developed in the lead up to Brexit and has very much stayed around since then. And again, found it very interesting. And then the one work of fiction for the month was The Discomfort of Evening by Lucas Rijneveld, which was really intriguing and memorable. It's not a book that I don't think I'll be forgetting this book at all, but I'm still not entirely sure what I think of it on the whole. Sort of structurally as a novel, I had one or two issues, but I mean that they weren't, they wouldn't write the book off, and there was something to the writing and to the main character, to our protagonist, that I found kind of heartwarming, despite how disturbing most of the book is. So that's my sort of general impression of the book, without giving too much away. I don't go much deeper than that. when I talk about it in the other video, but that's my sort of general idea of it. And then there are 5 books to talk about that I finished since making that random reading update. A lot of very happy stuff. We've got On the Natural History of Destruction by W.G. Sebald, a writer I really love, and this is well, it's a sort of a miscellany of texts on the state of mind in Germany following the Second World War, particularly focusing on, as the cover may suggest, the air raids, the air war, and particularly the Allied bombings of Dresden and Hamburg and other big German cities. And essentially, the way that the subject wasn't really addressed at all in the years following the Second World War in Germany. There's a picture here, I'll see if I can find it, of all this rubble with sort of foliage all growing from the rubble, and so essentially it's just been left, and they're almost pretending that it's always been that way, or there's this sort of element of something being unspoken, and people are just walking past all the rubble without addressing it, pretending it's just the way the landscape has always been. And that's the first section, is this sort of essay. Well, it's sort of taken from some lectures he gave in Zurich, and they were quite controversial, these lectures. And then following on from that, from this discussion on the air war and on the bits that we know of it and how people reacted, there are some fairly traumatic stories and really awful descriptions of the damage of this kind of warfare, and what happens to a human body in a firestorm like that. And yeah, it's not exactly happy reading, but I found it fascinating. There's a really quite interesting bit where he's essentially describing this, I think like BBC radio broadcast, that's describing what it's like to be on a British bomber plane, and then just seeing the bombs go down, and it's seemingly so easy just to drop them, and then they fly off back home, and it's describing that even when they're flying over the white cliffs of Dover, they can still see the sort of tints of fire on the horizon, because that's the scale of the destruction. And so that's sort of what he's meditating on in these lectures. And then there are 3 essays on 3 German writers who were all writing, some of them a little bit before, and then during, and then after the Second World War. None of them I'd heard of, and I'm not sure how widely translated they are into English. But the 3 authors are Alfred Anders, Jean Amery, and Peter Weiss. And I can't remember which one it was. One of them was really he seemed like quite a small man who was really just out for his own self-interest. And so he joined the Nazi Party, and he's sort of one of those who thought that he was really something. He was really a great writer, a great artist, and that joining the Nazi Party would give him a leg up, would get him in the right circles, would he'd get a good backing behind his book, and he'd finally get the recognition that he felt he deserved. Sebald's opinion of him is that he's really just quite a mediocre writer with the odd moment of brilliance, and in the context of then what he's condoning, what he's signing up to as being a member of the Nazi Party, just makes it so much more terrible and, you know, so much more scathing, I think. The thing that sort of confused me a little bit as I was going through these brief sort of these brief biographies of these three artists and writers, was I was like, why? I was thinking, why are you telling me about these people, and how on earth are they connected to what you've just told me about the air war? And then, of course, remembering it's all about the silence, and the fact is they're happy to talk about so many other things and so many other ways that Germany's been affected by, you know, just 20th century history, and yet the trauma of these bombings isn't addressed at all. It's and I think he's just underlining that silence in those essays. So it's really intriguing. A lot of this was quite new to me, and so I think once I'm a little more familiar with the subject matter, I might try it again. But just as a reading experience, I found it really, really arresting, and yeah, very intriguing. I've got 3 works of poetry to talk about. I don't think I've got all that much to say about them, so we'll see how it goes. The first up, Randall Jarrell, his selected poems, and it includes a complete collection, The Woman at the Washington Zoo. On the whole, I felt that the poems in that collection were a little stronger than everything he'd selected up to that point. However, there were some great poems earlier on as well. He's a poet I have mixed feelings about. Sometimes it feels brilliant, and it feels like he's really getting into the soul of things, really describing things in a new and exciting way. At other times it just feels a bit quaint. It sort of reminds me of rather unimaginative illustrations to a kid's fairy tale book. That's sort of the vibe of some of the poems that he's selected here. And he is very interested in fairy tales, and sometimes he gets across the darkness and the strangeness of some of these tales. But sometimes it's just a bit quaint, and yeah, so a bit mixed. But The Woman in the Washington Zoo, I'll be going back to, and there are some great translations as well, particularly translations of Rilke poems, and I love Rilke, and so I was very happy to find them in there towards the end of the book. And then I read Wisława's Szymborska, People on a Bridge. This is translated by Adam Czerniawski, and please, any Polish speakers, let me know how I'm doing with my Polish pronunciation. I don't think it's all that good, but I enjoyed Wisława Szymborska. Very sort of whittled down sort of poetry. It's getting things back to basics, and it's very I suppose inquisitive is what I think of. It's not adorned, but it's continually sort of probing at each poem's subject matter. That's sort of the rough description of what the poems are like. But I found it really valuable to have these poems that in some sense were so simple, but were so unrelenting in trying to get to the bottom of whatever it is the poem's about. And so yeah, I really quite enjoyed Wisława Szymborska, and I'll be coming back to her poetry at some point, well, again and again, hopefully. And then the last work of poetry that I finished this month was One Lark, One Horse by Michael Hoffman, really known as a translator from the German. He's translated Hans Fallader's Alone in Berlin, or in America it's called Every Man Dies Alone, which is amazing. He's translated Kafka. He's translated Gottfried Benn, who's up there somewhere, and plenty of other German poets and German novelists. I think he's even translated some Thomas Bernhard as well. So, yeah, lots of works from the German language. But he's also a poet in his own right, and a very wry and observational poet, sort of similar to Wisława Szymborska, maybe not quite as pared down, or maybe it's just that we're getting these in a very colloquial English, whereas in Szymborska it's more of a, with it being a translation, you have that what's the word, sort of an exactness to the language, and whether that's the poetry of Szymborska herself or the translator, just trying to get things just right, I'm not sure. That's the sort of difference, I suppose. There's a little more looseness to the language in Hoffman. On the whole, I enjoyed it. Once I sort of realised what the tone was for his poems, I enjoyed the collection more and more. And then finally, we've got Radical Wordsworth, The Poet Who Changed the World, by Jonathan Bate. And essentially, the title is really picking up on the fact that Wordsworth had a kind of life in two halves. There's the earlier period, he got involved in the French Revolution, and then he meets Coleridge, and there's this sense of him being really excited by revolutionary ideas and being quite radical, and then he just becomes more conservative as he gets older. But that's mirrored with this slow decline in his poetry, and it gets more stilted and more boring and more self-indulgent as he gets older. And often in selections of his poetry, it's really just the early stuff from this amazing sort of 10 years of his early career that's sort of focused on, and then the later stuff is, sort of better left forgotten. And initially I was worried that this biography by Jonathan Bate was just going to be on that initial period, and we weren't going to get the whole of his life. This is the whole of Wordsworth's life, but it was certainly more of a focus on that earlier period, and then a more sort of spotty history on just sort of filling in the blanks for later on, because his life was fairly boring and not all that eventful afterwards, and so it's about 500-600 pages of biography instead of some of the other Wordsworth biographies that are like 1,000 pages, and so it is really, really good. It's a great introduction, I think, to Wordsworth's life, and I think as well a good examination of Romanticism. We meet many of the other Romantic poets through this. We meet Coleridge. He's going to be a very important character in Wordsworth's life. We also meet Keats, who is infatuated by Wordsworth, but like many of the other Romantics, the later Romantics, the second wave, was kind of disappointed when he started to get a little more reactionary, and sort of they saw that he wasn't the poet he once was, and we get plenty of mention of Byron and Shelley and Charles Lamb and so people like that. So it's really, really good, really immerses you in the world of the Romantic period. And then there's this chapter in the middle, if I can find it, maybe I've gone, it's called From New School to Lake School, which is an examination of romanticism. As it goes on, it becomes more and more pertinent to the life of Wordsworth. But initially, it's sort of looking at how all, this thing we call romanticism is really built up of many, many little romanticisms. And there are various little schools within that. And, the sort of school that Wordsworth belonged to was coined the Lake School. And then at the very end of the book, there are two wonderful chapters that are really essays. One on Wordsworth's literary inheritance and how he really did shape, he sort of created the taste that would make him a literary icon. And so during that period when he's writing a lot of his best stuff, he's being derided because he's so different to the poets of the time. Whereas to us, looking back, he might seem a little more dusty or a little more conventional, because he's the one who sort of set the watermark for what poetry is and what we expect poetry to be, at least then, as we've sort of moved through the Victorian period and up to now, which again is just really intriguing to think about. And then there's a wonderful essay to finish off the book, which was really wonderful. I wasn't expecting it, which was called, if I can find it, it's called Love of Nature Leading to Love of Mankind, which I think is a quotation from one of his poems, and it's essentially about the way that Wordsworth and his love of the natural world, and his love of particularly the area he grew up and spent most of his life, the Lake District, really inspired people coming after him, people sort of campaigning for national parks both in America and here in Britain. That they, I think, sort of got that sort of fire from Wordsworth, and is then just sort of tracing how he's been sort of so influential in conservation movements and in environmentalism. And I think that idea of love of nature and becoming a love of mankind, or let's see if I can find, love of nature leading to love of mankind. Because I think when we think of the environment, we still sort of place humanity at the forefront. We're still thinking of how it affects us. Whereas for Wordsworth, what really comes across in his poetry is this connection, this deep connection that he has to certain landscapes and to nature itself. And then recognizing that humanity is just a small part of that, and so loving it because it's part of that. And sort of Bate, not to spoil the book, but sort of the note he ends the book on, which is just amazing, is this sense that maybe we need to take a leaf out of Wordsworth's book. Maybe we need Wordsworth more than ever to cultivate this deep love of nature, and out of that a deeper and maybe more helpful love for mankind. So that's a brief overview of everything that I've been reading. A really interesting reading month, a little different, at least to me it seems a little bit different to how things have been over the last few months, or really since most of my time here on booktube. I think you should have already seen my video about my reading plans for June, so you'll see there's hopefully at least some fiction on the cards for me there. So we'll see where June goes, but for now that's how things are looking. Please let me know if you have read any of these or what you think of any of these, but for now I hope you're doing very well, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.